The girl had just crossed over and found herself passionately kissing a handsome guy while in his arms. But the girl was overwhelmed with panic in her heart, because the man before her was not only the prince of the empire but also the one who would later become her killer. It turned out that this was the world of a novel. In her previous life, the girl had been an ordinary worker, living a simple and content life, immersed in her small moments of happiness every day. However, one day on her way home from work, the girl was lucky enough to be sent to another world by a passing truck. As soon as she opened her eyes, it was the scene from earlier. She had been kissing him for a full 2.5 minutes. Memories from her original life suddenly surfaced in the girl's mind. The handsome man before her was none other than Albert, the prince of the empire, while she was merely a maid assigned to serve him. Her brain felt like it had been struck by a bolt of lightning. She could hardly believe it. Her own true self would actually do something as bold as forcibly kissing the prince. It turned out that, while the prince was undeniably handsome and charming, he possessed the exceptional swordsmanship of the master of the reverse sword technique and was loved by countless citizens. But these actions have sparked the current emperor's dislike and jealousy. In fact, the emperor is not Albert's biological father because he is a eunuch. The fact that he was unable to have children was also a well-known truth within the empire. Ultimately, the emperor, tormented by feelings of inferiority, decided to select an ordinary heir. And that person was Albert. At the time, the emperor only saw him as an orphan with no power or influence. However, no one expected that he would later achieve such extraordinary success. As a result, the emperor, who was suspicious and blinded by extreme prejudice, casually accused Albert of a crime. He was locked up in a tower that had been enchanted with imprisonment magic. Aside from Albert, the only other resident in the entire tower was a maid. Because the emperor wanted to completely destroy Albert, he specifically chose a maid who had long been coveting Albert's body. She was also granted a magic wand. This wand served both as a tool to control Albert's physical restraints and as an item for passing through the tower. Without the maid's permission, it couldn't be used. Albert was not allowed to even enter the kitchen. The maid, who held the key to Albert's fate, began with a simple embrace. Then there was forceful kissing, and in the end, even more outrageous things were done. She used the wand in her hand to manipulate Albert as if he were a toy. However, Albert was no fool. He used his own temptation to gradually grasp the power of the magic wand. After a whole year, Albert escaped from the tower. And the first thing he did was cut off the head of the female servant. The maid passed away without even letting out a scream. Now the girl had somehow traveled into the body of the maid, Ruth. Even more coincidentally, Albert was planning to use a kiss to exchange for the chance to examine the wand. The closer Albert is, the closer Ruth's heart is, and the faster it jumps. To get rid of the entanglement of the other party, Luce directly threw the magic wand over. Watching Albert skillfully test the wand, Ruth almost felt like she wanted to die. After returning to her room, Ruth tried to calm herself down. Although the original ending was tragic, it didn't mean that she couldn't survive after traveling to this world. Since Albert was the future king, as long as she stayed by his side, it was like having a bright future of her own. Fortunately, the plot had only progressed to the kissing part, and Ruth still had a chance to turn things around and save their relationship. When Albert saw Ruth coming down the stairs, he smiled and asked if she needed anything. Ruth understood that he was faking a smile and didn't dare to let her guard down. It seemed like he could detect the rejection in her words. Albert teasingly asked, "Are you not satisfied with my kissing skills?" The girl almost couldn't control herself. After calming down, Ruth promised that if he didn't want to, it wouldn't be necessary to continue like this anymore. At this time, he realized that this woman seemed to have something to say. Luce took out a contract at random. She was about to make a deal with His Highness the Prince. What was the bargaining chip? My body? Ruth shyly waved her hands, not wanting to sleep with His Highness at all. Unexpectedly, in the next moment, Albert took the initiative to lift the girl's hair. "Why, don't you like me?" Ruth didn't know how to explain. She couldn't possibly say that she was no longer Ruth. So the girl ignored Albert's question and pleaded with him to carefully read the contents of the contract. Ruth told Albert that she was willing to help the prince leave this place. In return, all Albert needed to do was give her a sum of money enough for her to live a carefree life in the countryside forever. The most important part was the last clause, that there would be no awkward physical contact with His Highness the Prince. As soon as she finished speaking, Albert fixed Ruth with the same intense gaze. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Ruth in front of him was suddenly a completely different person. In response, Ruth explained that she had come to some realizations during the recent kiss. His past actions were nothing short of suicidal. After all, His Highness the Prince would eventually leave this place, and when that day came, you would surely turn around and kill me out of frustration. Albert was speechless. "What exactly were you thinking when you kissed me?" Ruth, however, had no way of expressing her frustrations. If she continued messing around with Albert, she knew it would only lead to disaster. While she was lost in thought, Albert suddenly leaned in close. As he twirled the girl's hair, he confessed, "Actually, I've liked you from the very beginning." Ruth was a little flustered by his words, but she knew Albert was testing her. This moment was crucial for whether she could earn the prince's trust. He told Albert that people could change in the blink of an eye. Upon hearing this, Albert let out a foolish laugh. Then he roughly pulled Ruth into his arms. "Let me check if you've really changed. If you don't want this, you can say it now." After saying this, Albert kissed her, but he felt no response from the girl. Albert then pushes Ruth down and then asks for it more enthusiastically, the girl's first day of traveling through consciousness. She was kissed by the handsome, tough men. The girl crossed world and became a hot girl who relied on the prince's body, using a magic wand every day to force the prince to hug himself gently. When Ruth proposed to end this relationship in the future, the prince was trying to see if the girl was serious, so he was so tough that he kissed the girl's lips. And feeling no response from Ruth to his kiss, Albert finally pulled his lips away. Seeing Ruth on the bed, looking as if weighed down by a heavy burden, Albert's mind was filled with countless thoughts. He suggested taking another look at the contract Ruth had mentioned. Ruth suddenly sat up on the bed, signaling to Albert that all he needed to do was sign the magical contract. But she had forgotten that Albert had never told anyone that he knew magic. In the face of Albert's many questions, Ruth attributed it to her sharp insight after all. "I know that His Highness wants to examine the wand to break the forbidden magic on it." Albert chuckled lightly, as if unknowingly. "If that's the case, why hand the wand over to me? For you, such an action brings no benefit." Ruth shyly tightened her grip on the contract. At the time, she had been completely enchanted by His Highness's handsome appearance. Albert had already anticipated this answer, but just when the girl thought everything was settled, Albert revealed that he couldn't use magic here. In other words, to fulfill the contract, it all depended on their mutual trust. Worse yet, Albert still couldn't trust Ruth. Ruth shivered all over. She couldn't give up at this crucial moment. Calming herself down, Ruth told Albert that in this deal both of them were equal. Neither of them wanted to be trapped in the tower forever. As long as His Highness met her conditions, she would also strive to fulfill the terms of the contract. The first request was that she would be guaranteed no life-threatening danger after leaving the tower. The second was to prepare enough funds for her to live without worries for the rest of her life. The third was that neither party could touch the other's body without permission. Then Ruth stated that if either side didn't abide by the terms, both would face appropriate punishment. The most severe punishment could even threaten their lives. Noticing that Ruth wasn't joking, Albert gladly agreed to sign the contract with her. As they were about to sign, Albert stopped and asked if Ruth would regret it, since she wouldn't be able to cling to him in the future. Ruth was speechless. In life-or-death situations, all desires fade away, thus the two officially signed the contract. Albert politely bowed to Ruth, hoping they could get along well during their remaining days in the tower. The next morning, Ruth got dressed early, as yesterday's signing meant she would now have to diligently perform her duties as a maid. Even if it was for that large sum of money in the future, she would try her best to meet her client's requirements. With the script in hand, Ruth believed she could easily handle it. But she had clearly underestimated Albert as a roommate. After tidying up her room, Ruth went downstairs and greeted Albert. Suddenly, she snapped to her senses. After his morning workout, Albert, freshly showered, appeared before her, disheveled. The sight made Ruth blush deeply. Even the male protagonist couldn't just walk around like that. Shocked, Ruth ran up to Albert, asking, when did His Highness gain the freedom to move around the tower? It turned out that after researching the magic barrier yesterday, Albert could now move freely on the second floor. Seeing Albert's tempting and seductive demeanor, Ruth found herself utterly speechless. Once Albert was fully dressed, Ruth sternly reminded him not to dress so casually like before. After what had just happened, Ruth also realized that in the days to come, she would be living with a stranger. She knew nothing about Albert's personality or lifestyle. The only thing she could be sure of was that he had a history of indecent exposure. Afterward, Ruth asked Albert about his preferences. Just as Albert thought she was about to make another unusual request, Ruth explained that she simply wanted to know his favorite foods, as the kitchen was still the only place she could freely access. Unlike the meticulous Ruth, Albert had no strong opinions about food and casually said anything would do. Given that, Ruth decided to showcase some traditional dishes from her previous life. She had been deeply impressed by the food described in this novel. Although the novel was set in a Western fantasy world, the dishes featured were all simple, traditional home-cooked meals. The abundance of traditional ingredients was thanks to the novel's heroine, Soo-yena. She had opened a restaurant specializing in traditional cuisine, captivating the taste buds of most of the local populace. Stories about Soo-yena spread across the streets and even reached Albert's ears. Eventually, out of curiosity, Albert visited her restaurant, which was as far as the story had gone when Ruth read it. Though Ruth didn't know how Albert and the heroine's relationship would develop, she assumed Albert would appreciate the dishes, given that Soo Yina was a traditional chef. However, Ruth now faced another pressing problem. Every week, she had to submit a report to the eunuch emperor detailing how she tormented Albert. Only then would the emperor send her the supplies she needed to survive. Luckily, this week's report had already been written by her predecessor. But for the next one, Ruth had no idea how to navigate the pressures from both the emperor and the prince. Forced to live with the empire's most handsome man, Ruth found herself in a dilemma. Though she could use the wand to do whatever she wanted to this dashing man, she dared not entertain any inappropriate thoughts. This was because the strikingly handsome man before her wasn't just the empire's prince, he was also the terrifying figure destined to kill her in a fit of rage someday. But in order to obtain daily necessities, Ruth also needs to submit daily reports to the emperor on the torture of the prince. She handed the guard a note. The guard was a little confused when he saw that all the ingredients were written on. Ruth then explained that she wanted to starve the prince for several days, then feed him some extremely spicy food to force him to surrender. Of course, these plans must be passed on to the emperor after Ruth has finished dealing with the soldiers and returns to the room. Albert, who was hiding behind the door and eavesdropping, couldn't help but burst into laughter. "Do you really have any intention of torturing me like this?" Ruth was a little angry. "Only in this way can we avoid the emperor's suspicion and obtain precious ingredients by playing the role of a villain." Thanks also to the fact that she has read dozens of novels about evil girls. Next, it's time for Ruth to make the food. Albert didn't take it seriously after hearing this anyway. As long as she can't be eaten to death, that's fine. In just these few days of getting along, Albert gradually adapted to the new Ruth. Ruth has indeed changed. In the past, I only knew that it was based on my own body. Now he even cooks for himself. It's like she's become a different person. Ruth still had the same explanation for this. She only realized her stupidity after that kiss. Albert is not naive enough to believe this. A person suddenly changes, there must be a certain reason behind it. Although Albert still doubts her, but there was another thing that worried her more. That is, I hope that His Highness the Prince will never fall in love with me. This is a versatile routine in time travel novels. Once the book girl changed the plot of the original novel, the male protagonist in the book is bound to have entanglements with him. But Ruth doesn't want anything to happen between her and Albert, because she knows that their love will certainly end in tragedy. Although Albert's noble family has a high lineage, their family has actually been in decline for years. When Albert was 8 years old, he was first poisoned. At the time, he, being young, had no idea who had poisoned him. It wasn't until both of his older brothers died in a fight for the inheritance that he realized. During Albert's recovery, the Count and Countess both died of an infectious disease. He thought being adopted by the Emperor would bring him happiness. However, now he finds herself trapped in a tower with a perverted maid. This life experience led Albert to become distrustful of everyone. In her previous life, Ruth also had a similar experience to Albert. Just after graduating from college, her parents died in a car accident. In her previous life, Ruth had a similar experience to Albert. Just after graduating from university, her parents passed away in a car accident. For the sake of her future life, she didn't even have time to grieve. That's why the girl chose to read novels as a way to escape from reality. Two people like them falling in love would only end up hurting each other. Upon hearing Ruth's words, Albert's expression instantly turned cold. "What you just said has been nonsense from the very beginning. I will never fall in love with you." Although Albert's words were somewhat harsh, Ruth felt a sense of relief after hearing them. "Also, Your Highness, please don't forget to secure my retirement," Ruth said. She then asked Albert when he would be able to leave this place. For Albert, leaving was no longer a difficult task. She had already part of the binding magic was lifted on her wand. Leaving now would undoubtedly give the Emperor an opportunity to take advantage. In the original story, Albert also stayed for a whole year before leaving. He wanted to exploit the loophole in the magic wand to expand her influence in the outside world, so that after escaping, he could completely choke the Emperor's throat. "I know you really want to leave, but I still need some time," seeing Ruth forcing a smile on her face. For the first time, Albert felt a slight emotional stir. A few days later, the king sent many precious ingredients. Ruth immediately became full of energy, as she could finally cook the dishes she was good at and no longer had to eat those strange ingredients from another world. Soon, a plate of spicy stir-fried rice cakes was ready. Both its appearance and aroma were incredibly appetizing. But it was uncertain whether Albert could accept such food. When the dish was placed on the table, Albert stared silently at the steaming stir-fried rice cakes in front of him. He had never seen such a peculiar dish. Ruth explained that this was the unique cuisine she had mentioned earlier. Albert found it a bit strange. Just a few days ago, Ruth had seemed lifeless while cooking, but today she was suddenly so excited. Did you poison this? Otherwise, you should try a bite first. Ruth respectfully complied, picking up a rice cake and putting it into her mouth to show him. Seeing the girl's cheeks turn red from the spiciness, Albert couldn't help but feel a bit worried. But in the next moment, Ruth was overjoyed and tearfully exclaimed that the rice cakes had a taste that could wash away all her stress. In her past life, she had always loved eating spicy food while drinking beer. He never expected that after crossing over, he would be able to taste this flavor again. Listening to Ruth's enthusiastic praise, Albert couldn't help but pick one up himself. After chewing for a moment, he put down his fork. Ruth thought it might not be to Albert's taste and immediately began apologizing. Looking up, she saw Albert smiling as he said, "This rice cake is really spicy." The handsome prince and the girl were in the same room together. I simply mentioned that the rice cake was spicy, and it triggered Ruth's endless daydreams. The girl kept banging her head against the table, trying to stop herself from overthinking, yet she couldn't help but feel happy that Albert liked the dish she made. Whenever Albert was in a good mood, the corner of his left lip would involuntarily curl up. This was something even Albert himself didn't know, as the two of them sat together eating spicy stir-fried rice cakes, perhaps in this moment. It was the first time Albert experienced what happiness truly felt like. That night, Ruth tossed and turned in bed, unable to fall asleep. Having not eaten spicy food for a long time, she was a bit hungry. The noise from her walking out of the room caught Albert's attention. Ruth was startled by Albert's question. She explained that she was bored and wanted to do some needlework, but no sooner had she finished speaking than the girl collapsed to the ground, feeling unwell. Her wand fell to the bottom of the cabinet, and at that moment, Ruth was crying out in pain from her stomach. With no other option, Albert decided to use his wand to help treat her. Ruth kept searching her body, but she couldn't find her wand, and her stomach pain continued to worsen. In the end, he shakily pulled out a needle and then pricked his own finger. Seeing this, Albert quickly rushed forward to stop her, but to his surprise, Ruth let out a burp right after. Ruth explained. She explained that in her previous home, people used this method to relieve intense pain. Albert, holding his mouth, thought to himself that he certainly didn't believe in such things. After a while, Ruth felt much better. She asked Albert to hand her a handkerchief. However, to her surprise, he grabbed Ruth's hand and started licking it to clean it, shamelessly claiming that in his previous home, people used this method to stop bleeding. This action made Ruth's heart race, and as a result, she couldn't sleep well the entire night. Although the prince might indeed have some insecurities, the girl never expected him to engage in such behavior as licking someone else's finger. How was this any different from being teased by Albert? Ruth suddenly felt both wronged and flustered. Could it be that she unknowingly did something that made him like her more, leading the situation to deviate from the original story and end up as one of those cliched plots? Thinking this, Ruth quickly told herself to stop overthinking. Her only goal was to leave the tower and live a peaceful life. In the following days, Ruth tried every possible way to avoid contact with Albert, and his strange behavior, of course, aroused Albert's suspicion. She remembered that 4 days ago. She had merely asked if the wound had healed, and Ruth quickly excused herself, hurriedly returning to her room to rest. She only prepared a portion for him during meals, and when there was nothing to do, Ruth would walk around, pretending to be very busy. With confused, Albert asked Ruth why she wasn't eating. Ruth smiled and cheerfully replied that she wasn't hungry. Soon, the growling of her stomach betrayed her. Reluctantly, Ruth had no choice but to return to the dining room and eat with Albert. At that moment, Albert had also guessed the reason behind Ruth's odd behavior. Ruth felt deeply wronged. In such a small space, her actions were certainly quite obvious. Suddenly, he thought that if there was something else in the tower aside from them to distract their attention, it might make things much better. So, Ruth suggested that she wanted to adopt a pet. Faced with Ruth's earnest plea, Albert reluctantly agreed. Soon it was Monday, and Ruth took out the weekly report, preparing to hand it over. To her surprise, when she opened the door, she saw a strange creature at the guard's feet. The guard explained that it was a stray cat they had encountered on the way. It was a white cat. Before Ruth could voice her confusion, a little creature quickly darted into the room, and Ruth realized that this thing might have quite the mysterious origin. It could easily come and go, ignoring the tower's confinement magic. According to the guard, this little creature had no parents to look after it. Ruth suddenly thought of her past life. Out of sympathy, she suggested to the guard that she wanted to adopt the little creature. After a while, Ruth moved the supplies into the room, then turned her gaze to the stray cat she had just adopted. This creature didn't resemble a cat in the slightest. Not only did it have small feet on its head, but it also had wings and a tail on its back. Based on its features, it looked more like a dragon from a movie, but dragons never appeared in the original novel. Just then, Ruth's thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "You're clearly not a mage. How can you see me?" The stray cat the girl had casually adopted turned out to be a baby dragon, hearing the little dragon speak in human language. Ruth hurriedly found Albert, but when he saw the animal in her hands, Albert couldn't help but furrow his brows. Albert explained that this was a stray cat he had adopted from a guard, but Ruth had overheard the little creature speaking in human language. Albert told her that this creature was a dragon, leaving Ruth completely stunned. She had never seen anything about dragons mentioned in the original story. However, if she could manage to adopt it, effortlessly dealing with the king someday would no longer be just a dream. Those who could recognize a dragon's identity were usually one of two types, a dragon's contractor or a mage like him. However, Ruth was clearly neither. Ruth herself had no idea what was going on. Perhaps she had inadvertently generated magic while using the wand. However, just as she was immersed in the joy of adopting the baby dragon, Albert mercilessly poured cold water on her excitement, explaining that an adult dragon and a baby dragon were entirely different beings. An adult dragon, with its immense magical power, could trigger natural disasters and even transcend time and space to know both the future and the past. However, baby dragons had no abilities at all and didn't even deserve to be called dragons. Due to their extreme vulnerability, they chose to take the form of cats to protect themselves. A baby dragon needed at least 500 years to grow into an adult dragon. Even if it managed to survive those 500 years, countless trials would still await it in the future. Moreover, the majority of dragons couldn't make it through and ultimately met their demise. This is also why, even though dragons really exist in the world, they are still considered legends. Upon hearing about death, Ruth's eyes immediately filled with tears. Is there really no way to save him? Helpless, Albert could only patiently explain that the baby dragon needs to undergo a transformation during its growth. Most dragons die because they can't bear the pain, but if a contracted partner can share the pain with them, the chances of survival would increase significantly. However, there are very few mages in the world willing to form a contract with a dragon, and even adult dragons won't help baby dragons. This fully demonstrates just how great the risk of a baby dragon's transformation and growth really is. Hearing this, Ruth's mood became a little heavy. After returning to her room, she distractedly played with the little dragon. Perhaps Albert was right. If there's no way to take responsibility for its life after adopting it, it would be a source of pain for both parties. Suddenly, the little dragon's stomach let out a growl. Upon learning that the little dragon was hungry, Ruth perked up and went to feed it first. It was the first time the little dragon had seen Ruth's cooking, and its eyes were filled with excitement. Ruth picked up a piece of silk and handed it over. The little dragon ate happily, and seeing this cute scene, Ruth almost lost control of himself. He asked the little dragon how old it was. The little dragon loudly declared that it was 499 years old. Upon hearing this, Ruth was stunned. He never expected that in just 1 year the little dragon would turn 500. Doesn't that mean the little dragon's time would be up soon? If he abandoned it at this moment, he probably wouldn't be able to find anyone else to take him in. Then, Ruth asked the little dragon what it had been doing all these years. The little dragon said that for these 499 years, he had been sleeping in a cave. Now, with only 1 year left, he just wanted to see the world properly before passing away. Since he had no reason to live, the girl clenched her fists upon hearing this. She too had once thought that she had no reason to keep living. It was the ordinary moments spent with friends that had helped him pull through, and Ruth didn't want to just let the little dragon die like this. He picked up the little dragon and asked what his name was. Upon learning that he didn't have a name, Ruth racked his brain trying to think of one. In the end, he named the little dragon Baby because the little dragon was completely snow white. After saying this, Ruth firmly stated that from now on, he would live with Baby. He would create a reason for Baby to keep living. After convincing Baby, there was only one problem left: how to explain Baby's situation to the harsh prince. Seeing Albert's troubled expression, Ruth nervously asked what was wrong. It turned out that Albert had just been contacting his loyal subjects, trying to find the right opportunity to leave this place. Only then did Ruth realize that Albert had secretly planned everything. Not only was he handsome, but his hair was also top-notch. Ruth's flattery made Albert feel overjoyed. Soon after, Albert asked what Ruth planned to do after leaving. Ruth planned to buy some land and lease it out. As for himself, he planned to travel around and try different hairstyles. His goal was to visit all the best food spots. If there were skilled pastry chefs, he would come specifically for them to serve him. Albert hadn't expected that Ruth's ideal life would be so indulgent. In stark contrast to Ruth, Albert's only goal after leaving was to become the king. Ruth also understood that the things they both longed for were completely different. After all, Albert was the male lead of the novel, while she was just the villainous supporting character in the story. Perhaps the most reasonable arrangement for their futures was that they didn't have each other. At this moment, Ruth finally brought up the baby dragon. He pitifully said that after leaving this place, he would be all alone, but he didn't want to be lonely, so he decided to adopt the little dragon and live together. The girl wanted to adopt a baby dragon as a pet, and Albert couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. Could it be that in just one day, the girl had developed feelings for the little dragon? After all, the chances of this dragon surviving were less than 1 in 1,000. Starting a relationship that was bound to have no future seemed foolish to him. Ruth argued logically, saying that giving up on a relationship before it even began was even more foolish. He wouldn't abandon the little dragon because of something that hadn't even happened yet. Seeing that Albert didn't respond, Ruth began to sweat nervously, thinking that Albert might reduce the money and land he had promised him because of this. To Ruth's surprise, Albert actually agreed, praising him for solving a problem that had been bothering him. Afterward, Albert asked Ruth to come to his room in the evening to give him a haircut. Upon hearing this, the girl instantly became like a frightened rabbit. After all, it was an unwritten rule that they didn't enter each other's rooms at night. But when he saw Albert's handsome face, Ruth couldn't help but agree, almost as if by some strange impulse. Then Ruth went downstairs to prepare dinner, but unexpectedly he slipped and lost his balance. In a split second, Albert appeared just in time to catch Ruth and prevent him from falling down the stairs. The girl was then gently pulled into Albert's embrace. He could even smell the fragrance emanating from Albert's body. "Are you okay?" A simple expression of concern instantly made the girl's heart race. She hurriedly pushed Albert away. She then fled to the kitchen as if running away. At this point, Ruth was already regretting agreeing to give the prince a haircut, but since he had already agreed, he couldn't back out now. Seeing the sweat forming on the girl's face, the little dragon asked if Ruth was feeling hot, despite Ruth saying she wasn't. But the sweat that continued to trickle down betrayed him, so the obedient little dragon began to fan Ruth beside him. This cute scene made Ruth wish he could capture it with his phone, but unfortunately in this world there was nothing to record it. This time Ruth made fried chicken pieces. He noticed that the little dragon took a strong interest in the chicken. Ruth added a piece for him and the little dragon happily bit into it, munching away. The little dragon's eyes lit up with excitement. This was the first time he had ever tasted such delicious food. Ruth immediately filled a whole plate for him. The other plate was sent to Albert. Ruth believed that no one in the world could resist the temptation of fried chicken, but just as he reached the door, he saw Albert holding his magic staff, his face extremely serious. It turned out that it was because the emperor couldn't stand Albert. So the emperor had secretly ordered the destruction of the land where Albert had once lived, causing the deaths of many innocent civilians. At this moment, Albert noticed Ruth standing at the door. Noticing his trembling hands, Albert reached out and placed his hand on Ruth's forehead to check if he was sick. "Your expression clearly shows something's wrong. Were you scared by what you just heard?" Albert asked. Ruth openly admitted that he was indeed frightened as he hadn't expected the current emperor to be such a wicked person. Though the emperor's actions certainly angered Albert, placing his anger as the top priority wouldn't change anything. He had to calm himself and think about how to expand his own power. So when Albert heard Ruth insult the emperor, he simply felt a sense of pleasure. Then the two of them sat down to eat. Ruth handed a drumstick to Albert. Typically, this was an action reserved for those considered important. Ruth hoped to use this gesture to get the prince to give him more land. Of course, Albert rejected the idea without a second thought, but he did admire Ruth for being able to create such various and unique dishes. Upon hearing this praise, Ruth couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions, knowing that after him, Albert would meet another girl skilled in cooking. Although the plot was gradually changing, he wasn't sure if the female lead would still fall in love with Albert. Just as he was deep in thought, Albert interrupted him. Ruth explained that he was simply curious whether the prince had ever loved anyone. He stared at the drumstick, lost in thought for a moment. Albert replied that he had once been in love back when he was still young. The person had a pair of very kind eyes. Just as Ruth was getting more interested, Albert abruptly ended the conversation, using the excuse of eating. Only the smile on his face proved the beauty of that memory. That night, Albert prayed alone in his room, hoping that the innocent civilians who had died because of the emperor would find peace. At that moment, the magic staff reacted. It was a report from Albert's subordinates, informing him that they had already dealt with half of the mages involved in imprisoning the prince. The remaining ones were still being searched for. Suddenly, the subordinate became hesitant and stammered, under Albert's pressing questions. The subordinate hesitated, hoping Albert would go out for a while soon, even though they had already made a contract to not overstep each other. But Ruth still couldn't resist kissing Albert again. Not long ago, Albert had received news from his subordinates, stating that a very tricky problem had arisen outside, which required the prince's personal attention. At that time, he would do everything he could to eliminate the maid and help the prince escape. However, to his subordinate's surprise, Albert not only rejected him but also smiled brightly and called out the maid's name. He also mentioned that he had changed a lot. In fact, even Albert himself found it unbelievable. When he had just been released from prison with Ruth, he had constantly thought about killing him as soon as he got out, but perhaps it was due to Ruth's change, or perhaps because they had spent such a long time in a small, confined space together. Unknowingly, Ruth had become unforgettable in his mind. Meanwhile, Ruth was troubled over the little dragon's situation. Since the little dragon ate the same food as humans, perhaps strengthening him in the same way could work, but Ruth had never watched fitness videos before. So Ruth placed his hopes on Albert. The next day, Ruth got up and went downstairs. Still half asleep, Ruth was instantly awake upon seeing what was in front of him. It turned out that Albert had just finished his morning workout. Seeing Ruth, Albert was also surprised. "Why are you up so early today?" Ruth explained that he wanted the little dragon to get some exercise, but since he had no experience, he hoped to ask the prince for help. "You mean you want to hand the baby dragon over to me and then just walk away?" Albert said. Just as he pointed out, Ruth was momentarily at a loss for how to respond. Then Albert proposed a condition: he would help train the little dragon. But Ruth would have to join as well. Ruth tried to bargain, but Albert rejected the idea. And so Ruth was forced to wake up at dawn every morning to train. Albert had just said, starting today. On the other side, Ruth was already preparing to sneak away, playfully saying, "I'll leave the little dragon to you today, love you." But as he returned to his room, Ruth realized he might have made a mistake. Just now, he had said it to Albert almost impulsively, and he wasn't sure if Albert would misunderstand because of it. In the evening, Ruth arrived at Albert's room as promised to cut his hair. Although he appeared full of energy, he felt completely uncertain inside. Ruth leaned in to examine Albert's hair and noticed that his bangs had grown long enough to poke into his eyes. Unknowingly, the two of them had gotten closer and closer. When Ruth snapped back to his senses, he quickly stood up and gestured with his hands, showing how much he would need to cut. To Ruth's surprise, Albert directly grabbed his hand and placed it on his head. "Cut it however you want," he said. Ruth's heart began to race with nervousness. Ruth even wondered if Albert could hear his heart racing. After a while, Ruth finally finished cutting Albert's hair. Just as he was about to relax, Ruth noticed that Albert had been staring at him the whole time. Then Albert asked Ruth, "Should we kiss?" Before Ruth could react, a soft, warm sensation spread across his lips. After a long while, the two gradually pulled apart. Ruth realized that Albert didn't see him as just an ordinary maid. He asked Albert directly whether he liked him. Albert didn't answer. Instead, Albert asked what Ruth thought of him. Ruth admitted that he had feelings for the prince. But Ruth clarified that it wasn't love, just that he had feelings. Then Albert asked the next question: "If that's the case, why did you kiss me?" "Because you made it impossible for me to refuse," Ruth replied. Albert seemed a bit helpless. He admitted that he cared deeply about Ruth. Although he had previously said he wouldn't fall in love with him, after noticing how Ruth had changed, his feelings had shifted. Saying this, he reminded Ruth that he wasn't accustomed to unrequited love. From now on, he would do his best to make Ruth fall in love with him. At that critical moment, the wand suddenly reacted. His subordinate reported that Duke Mason had been attacked by a dark sorcerer and urgently needed the prince to come and see him personally. Although the situation was sudden, Albert immediately made a decision to go out with Ruth. It was, after all, the first time Ruth had met the prince's subordinates. However, Ruth was soon suspected by the subordinates of being the one who had manipulated the prince. Not long ago, Albert had planned to take Ruth out with him. To avoid being spotted by the soldiers at the door, the two of them made their way to the top of the tower. As Albert used his wand, the ceiling slowly disappeared, revealing the deep blue starry sky above. Ruth never expected to escape the tower so easily. It had been a long time since he last felt the fresh air outside. Albert, however, seemed to be used to it by now. He reminded Ruth that the Duke Merlin they were about to meet, although very popular among the young ladies, was not someone to be underestimated. "But you'd better focus on me a little more," Albert said. The girl nodded repeatedly, not daring to think about anything else. Soon after, Albert began chanting a spell. Suddenly, Ruth felt a wave of dizziness, though Albert assured him that he was fine. However, Ruth still kept this moment in mind, especially since he noticed how curious he was about the magic. Albert explained the steps to set up the teleportation spell one by one, and then the two of them held hands as they passed through the magic circle. Not only did the small dragon in her arms react to the magic, but even Ruth herself felt drawn to it. After arriving at the Duke's residence, a bustling crowd of mysterious figures emerged from within. Leading the group was Baron Bersan. After exchanging a few polite words, Albert immediately inquired about the Duke's condition. Ruth, shivering from the cold, was trembling visibly. Without hesitation, Albert, under the watchful eyes of everyone, draped the mink fur coat gifted by the Baron over her shoulders. He immediately placed it over Ruth's shoulders, leaned in close to her ear, and gently whispered, advising her to let him know if she needed anything and not to endure it silently. The subordinates nearby, upon witnessing this scene, were so furious that they nearly ground their teeth to dust, even though Albert introduced Ruth as his newly recruited loyal retainer. But the Baron immediately recognized her as the woman who had conspired with the Emperor to torment the prince during the time when Albert and the others were visiting the Duke. Baron Bersan approached Ruth, hoping to learn from her the whereabouts of the antidote. It turned out that because Albert's behavior today was completely different from usual, the Baron was convinced that Ruth had poisoned him. Ruth had no idea how to explain, and even she herself found Albert's behavior unusual. She sincerely stated that she had never given Albert any medication, and that if she had such an ability, dealing with the Baron would be no problem. No sooner had she finished speaking than a sharp blade was pressed against Ruth's neck. Ruth trembled in fear. She only wanted to say that she had earned the prince's recognition through her own efforts and that she was willing to fully share the method with the Baron. In simple terms, it was through her cooking skills and by constantly flattering the prince whenever she had the chance. Baron Bersan was somewhat skeptical, as this seemed no different from the things he usually did himself. However, the expression on the girl's face didn't seem like she was lying. Reluctantly, Baron Bersan had no choice but to leave and go find Albert to get to the bottom of the matter. That night, as Ruth was sleeping in her room, she groggily heard someone talking nearby. Ruth mumbled a couple of responses, and then a cold sensation suddenly woke her up. When she opened her eyes, she saw Albert sitting at the foot of her bed. The girl was immediately startled. She reminded Albert that such behavior violated their agreement, but Albert responded that it was the girl who had agreed to it herself. Ruth then remembered the voice she had heard earlier while falling asleep, but she couldn't understand why Albert was treating her this way. At that moment, the blanket suddenly shifted, and the small dragon poked its head out from underneath. Ruth was about to thank the small dragon for helping her resist the prince's temptation, but to her surprise, the next moment, the dragon hopped away. The small dragon had seen Albert's deathly glare, but after that, Albert did nothing and simply got up to leave. He told Ruth to pack up and get ready to leave, but Ruth was still immersed in the atmosphere from earlier. Because of what Baron Bersan had said in the morning, she couldn't help but wonder if Albert had truly been enchanted by someone. Seeing that the girl hadn't moved, Albert asked if she was reluctant to leave. The girl admitted that it was indeed more spacious and cozy here than in the tower. Then Albert promised to redecorate the tower once they returned. Overcome with joy, Ruth nearly blurted out, "I love you," but thankfully she reacted in time and prevented a disaster from happening. But Albert turned around and asked, "Why did you suddenly change your words?" "I know that was something you blurted out, so don't overthink it. Just say it to me directly," Albert said. Hearing the girl almost blurt out, "I love you," the excited prince urged her to continue. However, after realizing what had happened, Ruth couldn't bring herself to say it. Instead, she used a hand gesture to form a heart as a substitute. This was the first time Albert had seen such a way of expressing it. Ruth then followed up with several other hand gestures. At last, Ruth managed to temporarily deceive Albert. Just then, a report came in from her subordinate, announcing that Duke Mason had arrived for a visit. This was the Duke Albert had mentioned, the one with an exceptionally handsome appearance. Ruth immediately became curious and wanted to see what he looked like. Seeing Ruth adjust her skirt, Albert teased her, saying she seemed quite concerned about her appearance. Ruth, feeling a bit guilty, explained that it was just proper etiquette. Shortly after, Albert instructed for Duke Mason to come in. With his jet black hair and stern expression, it was indeed Albert, embodying the traditional image of a northern duke. Mason also noticed Ruth standing nearby. He had heard that this girl was one of His Highness's newly recruited loyal subjects. Ruth expected him to dislike her like everyone else, but Mason simply advised her to take good care of His Highness. Then, with a worried expression, he scolded Albert for pushing himself too hard on this trip. As Albert was about to leave, Mason began searching through his own belongings. Mason handed a small pouch to Albert, who then tossed it directly to Ruth. It turned out to be a magical pouch. Anything you wanted to take with you could be placed inside. Ruth was completely stunned and double-checked with Albert to confirm if he was telling the truth. Albert didn't bother to check if Mason had agreed. As long as it made Ruth happy, that was all that mattered. Soon, the girl had emptied the entire room, taking everything she could find. Proudly, Ruth declared that she was simply following His Highness's orders. Albert smiled faintly and praised her for carrying out the task so efficiently. This unexpected scene stunned the two people behind them. They had thought that with so many items packed, it would be very heavy. But Ruth simply applied a little force and lifted the pouch with ease. "Let's set off now," she said as Albert extended his hand. Ruth instinctively took his hand. At the crucial moment, she handed the pouch to Albert and turned to pick up the little dragon. This experiment made Albert realize that his approach was very effective with Ruth. After passing through the magic circle, the two of them returned to the tower. Ruth set the little dragon down, letting him go to sleep first. However, the next moment, Albert suddenly drew his gun and collapsed to the ground. The little dragon asked Ruth, confused, what had happened. Ruth explained that Albert was sick. Hearing this, the little dragon's face filled with sorrow, as to him, being sick meant death. Ruth immediately understood this was the dragon's trial Albert had mentioned before. With determination, she promised the little dragon that she would prove that even in sickness, death was not inevitable. Later, Albert lay on the bed, and Ruth brought a basin of warm water, preparing to help him wash up. However, at the crucial moment, the girl hesitated. She reminded Albert that her actions were not driven by personal feelings. Albert, of course, understood, so he allowed Ruth to do as she wished. While wiping his face, Ruth asked, "Why did you hide this from me? Why did you keep pushing yourself when you started feeling unwell right after leaving the tower?" Ruth asked. "If you just said something, I could have at least prepared some medicine." In truth, this stemmed from Albert himself. His position required him to bear the expectations and pressures of others, so facing pain alone seemed like the best option. Moreover, due to the effects of the confinement magic, the farther he was from the tower, the greater the damage his body would endure. Normally, he would never share such things with anyone, but this time he told Ruth everything. After hearing this, Ruth hoped that next time, if Albert felt unwell, he would just speak up immediately. He wouldn't feel pressured just because of his highness. Taking a closer look at Albert's face, Ruth could see that it was indeed very different from their usual interactions. She guessed that at this moment, Albert must be enduring immense pain. Afterward, Ruth went to fetch water and medicine and change his clothes. When she returned, she saw Albert struggling, gasping for breath in pain. Albert reassured her not to panic, saying that he would recover in about 3 days. He added that the cost of this was actually considered mild. Albert forced himself to sit up and asked Ruth to help him change clothes. As the buttons slowly came undone, Ruth's heart started to race faster. "Are you nervous?" The sudden question left Ruth at a loss for words. Even Albert himself didn't quite believe it. After all, Ruth used to enjoy physical contact with him at the beginning, but now she seemed like a different person. However, hadn't he changed as well? After everything was done, Ruth advised Albert to get a good night's sleep. Those troublesome matters could be thought about later.